This episode of Rise Up is brought to you by Minute with Mary. Head on over to minutewithmary.com to try out some new skincare or cosmetics.
I am not throwing away my shot. I am not throwing away my shot. Hey, yo, I'm just like my country. I'm young, scrappy, and hungry, and I'm not throwing away my shot.
From Providence, Rhode Island, welcome to Rise Up. It's a podcast dedicated to the smash Broadway hit Hamilton. So sit back and relax and let's raise a glass to freedom.
We're gonna rise up, ain't time to take a shot. We're gonna rise up, ain't time to take a shot. We're gonna rise up, rise up. It's time to take a shot. Rise up, rise up. It's time to take a shot. Rise up. It's time to take a shot. Rise up. Take a shot, shot, shot. It's time to take a shot, time to take a shot. And I am not throwing away my shot.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back. My name is Mary Larson.
My name is Blake, and I am ready to frackin' geek out.
Yes.
History geek out. Like, if you've listened to Outlander Cast before, and obviously you have for the most part, for most of you, you know that we like to do our history episodes on Outlander Cast because it's so history rich. And I take special care of those kinds of episodes because they mean so much to me. You know, there's nothing quite like a good history nerd out.
Nothing quite like
There's
it. There's
nothing quite like it because, like, there's a lot of dorks out there that have fun. There's a lot of dorks that talk like, you know, Stranger Things or Dungeons and Dragons or Game of Thrones. But those history dorks, they have a special kind of dorkage that are just reserved for elite dorks.
Agreed. And thankfully, one of them hosts this podcast.
That's right. And it ain't you.
No.
Unfortunately, it's me. And you guys get to be privy to hear all about the history dorkage today, because today we're talking about the history of Alexander Hamilton and the man behind the musical. And we're actually bringing in someone who's
wicked smart.
Wicked smart. My girl's wicked smart. Okay, we'll put it that way. Before we get into the rest of the show, we wanted to remind you that you can subscribe to this podcast on Patreon, or you can subscribe to it on iTunes, and you can find us on social media at Mary and Blake, whether it's on Facebook or on Twitter. And you can actually go to maryandblake.com to find all of our podcasts and blogs that are there, including The North Remembers. It's a Game of Thrones podcast. If you haven't seen the final season yet, or you're just beginning to watch it because you wanted to wait to go through the whole season, you can go listen to it there. Or even This Is Us 2, which is actually coming back. This Is Us coming back in the fall of 2019. So we're really excited about that. And obviously Outlander Cast as well. So you can go to maryandblake.com, check out all the blogs and podcasts that we have there. Mary, are you ready to do this? Are you ready to get into this amazing discussion that we had that when we recorded it lasted for about an hour and 45 minutes?
You raise a glass, man. Let's do this.
Ladies and gentlemen, you could have been anywhere in the world tonight, but you're here with us in New York City. Are you ready for a cabinet meeting, huh? The issue on the table.
Today, we're talking the actual history behind Hamilton, the man, and the world that he found himself in. So we brought in an expert. Joining us today is Joanne Freeman. She is a historian and tenured professor of history and American studies at Yale University. She has published 2 books, given lectures across the country, and researched Alexander Hamilton for more than 40 years, guys. She is regarded as a leading expert on his life and legacy. In fact, her research helped inform aspects of Hamilton the musical, and she consulted on the Hamilton exhibit in Chicago that recently opened. So Joanne, thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Rise Up today.
I am really happy to be here.
So I have a question for you, Joanne, just right off the top, right off the bat. Do you think that Alexander Hamilton would be a fan of his musical?
No. He would not be. I think for 2 reasons. One of them is kind of obvious. I don't think he'd be thrilled that he was being called a bastard smack in the middle of Broadway, and that was being sung to the world. So that, I don't think the singing about his background would thrill him immensely. But the other thing, and I think the more interesting one, is he always assumed that his politics were not popular, and that he was not popular with the public. He was doing what he thought was best. And I think he prided himself on that. So I don't think he would know what to do being popular, and I even think he might distrust it. So he would be having a complicated time right now, I guess is what I would say.
So you're saying he's a career contrarian then?
He's probably a lifetime contrarian in some way or another.
Now, which part of the show takes the most dramatic liberty in your opinion?
Oh, wow. What's interesting is when I saw the show, I came at it reverse, right? So when I first saw the show, my response was, holy smoke, there's a lot of real history in here.
Yep.
Which I didn't expect in a musical.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a lot of history in the play, as far as factually, and then even regarding some of Hamilton's letters, and at least one Jefferson letter, are in the lyrics, right? Which, as a document person, made my brain explode. But there are many, many things that either aren't in it, or aren't addressed, or are manipulated to make good musical theater. There's a whole string of them. You could say on a sort of general level, Burr and Hamilton definitely were rivals, but not quite like constantly bumping up against each other in that way kind of rivals. And of course, it's wonderful for a musical. And there's some truth there, so that's okay. On a broader level, you could say, it's a play about a guy and his circle. It's not really about Hamilton's world. And on the one hand, I think the play has done some amazing things for how people understand history and the founding, right? It made the founding real for people. It reminded people, or actually taught them about contingency, and everything wasn't for sure. And it made the founders, with a capital F, human. And I all of those things are great, but it's portraying history in a way that isn't really history. And so, I'm a glass half full kind of person. So to me, this is a teaching opportunity. One could respond to this and say, oh no, now the public's going to think X, Y, and Z, and we have to teach against that. There are many things that are either inaccurate or not represented. But then again, I think there are some things in it that are very true.
Would you feel like the most egregious one being like Burr being at Hamilton's wedding?
Well, I don't know if I'd say that's the most egregious one, but he definitely was not at Hamilton's wedding.
Strolling on up late like a little wedding crasher.
I know.
Looking for some cake.
Here I am, Yeah. And Hamilton being surprised. He's like, oh, excellent, you came. Really?
That scene, though, does create one of my most favorite lines in all of Hamilton. You're the worst, Burr.
Oh, we use that on like a daily basis. Whenever either of us does something like really silly or dumb, we just say, you're the worst. And then we generally end it with Burr.
Of course, because we're dorks, and that's what we do. So we did talk about, the things that where the show does take its most dramatic liberty, maybe the wedding being one of them. What part of the essence of Hamilton do you think the show really captures at its best?
I would say the show captures aspects of his personality. He was a difficult guy. He always assumed he was the smartest person in the room. He was confrontational. There's a reason why he fought, or didn't fight, but became involved in 10 near duels before the final one with Burr.
Wow.
He was just a difficult person. And the play certainly captures some of that, what the play doesn't really capture, and I guess I don't expect it in a piece of musical theater, is Hamilton's politics, right? We get a little bit. We get a couple cabinet meetings. They actually sing about the assumption of state debts and neutrality, which is kind of mind-blowing. Washington's farewell address we get. But as far as the complications of Hamilton's politics, again, I guess I don't expect that in a piece of musical theater, but that's an important part of him, because that's really, more than anything else, what's earned him whatever reputation he had before this point.
You've said, I think one of my favorite quotes I've ever heard in my life is that Hamilton is an arrogant, irritating asshole.
Okay, but let me correct the record here. I said that on PBS and I got bleeped. And in like a warped way, it's kind of bucket listy, but also vaguely horrifying. But still kind of bucket listy. But what I actually said was many people considered him an arrogant, irritating asshole.
Oh, okay.
So that's important because that was the question I was asked, and I think that literally, although you're right, there it is out there in the world.
That exists.
Yes. Not beeping that out.
Once you say it on the internet, it never, ever goes away.
That's it.
So with the play in mind, do you think that Alexander Hamilton has kind of become romanticized in today's world? And is he really a kind of guy that, the normal person really should or would root for? I mean, is he someone we should be looking up to, being like, yes, this is the pinnacle of what an American should be?
Well, so first, yes, he has been romanticized a lot.
Yeah.
A lot, right? I mean, I sort of sometimes say that the person who emerges from the play is a kind of hero Hamilton. And the real Hamilton and actually the real anybody, you can't really brand them hero whatever, so that doesn't work. I'd say there are aspects of Hamilton that are admirable. I'd say, the fact that he had this overarching vision for the nation, the fact that he pushed to do what he felt was right for the new nation, all of that. You could point to aspects of his politics, and say they were admirable. You could point to aspects of them and say, he's not so bad that the Federalists kind of faded away. He was a little extreme in his politics. And, is there any founder, capital F again, who you want to put up on a pedestal in that way? I don't know if anyone should be on a pedestal. I think that you can't understand that whole period if you're romanticizing and idolizing the people in it. But, Hamilton, he's a complex person personally and politically, and that's part of what has kept me interested in him all these years.
So wait, you're saying that Washington is not a godlike figure and Burr is, in fact, not the worst?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So, there's a lot of facets, of course, to Hamilton. We're talking about this. He's the family man, the businessman, the immigrant, the statesman, the general. Which Hamilton is your favorite?
I don't know if I have a favorite. I would say the aspect of Hamilton that fascinated me was the logic behind what he did as a politician. Right? So now I'm a historian of political culture, the culture of how politics works. And that began partly because I wanted to figure out what the heck, why are all these politicians dueling? How did that make sense? Unfortunately for Hamilton, he's one of the rare cases in which someone died, but how does that relate to politics? So what intrigues me, and it partly intrigues me because in some ways he's really self-destructive, is what made him tick as a person and as a politician. And what can we learn about that? Because he's not the sort of guy who reveals himself on paper very often. So you really have to piece things together and look for patterns to figure him out.
You mentioned earlier that he was extreme in his politics, and without diving into all the minutia and all the nerd talk, you can do that on your own time. But what about him was so extreme, and where did the founding fathers really go awry with him when it came to his extreme politics?
Well, he was extreme. So at a time when, the United States broke away from England, created a new country that was extremely suspicious of centralized power as a king would have, right? In that environment, Hamilton's the guy who actually literally says at the Federal Convention that the British government is the finest government on the face of the earth, and whatever we can do here to bring it close to that is a good thing. Now, if you're a person who appears to be really focused on centralizing and empowering the national government, and you said that, you, all by itself, you become someone who's an extreme sort of central government national government building person in an era when that made people nervous. And that's why, many people called him a monarchist, because the assumption was, well, what he really wants is to just make the presidency into a monarchy and just ultimately have a little version of whatever's in England over here. So in his own time, that was way extreme. There's also, he had an unfortunate tendency to want to call in the military on civil unrest, right? That's not wonderful. And march the army in, whiskey rebels, let's get the army. He was a revolutionary who was very centered on law and order. And that's an interesting combination.
When it comes to today's politics, is there somebody that you could use as like a barometer that we could wrap our mind around?
Compare him to as Hamilton would be if he were one of today's figures.
Wow, that's a tough one.
Because I've always said that like Aaron Burr would be Mitt Romney.
You've always said this.
Yes.
Who are you saying this to?
To me in my own private Hamilton conversations.
And I'm afraid to ask why.
Well, listen, I'm a Massachusetts kid, so like I always felt that Romney did Massachusetts a little dirty. So I don't like that too much. But I feel like he doesn't have any convictions. He doesn't stay on one side of the aisle or the other. Like he never says anything. He's just there, and I can't stand that.
Well, I would say, if I were going to try and figure out who would be Burr, it would be someone who was very cryptic, because he was someone who didn't like putting things down on paper that might pin him down one way or another. He was someone who was really fluid in conversation and really good at sort of engaging people and pulling information from them without really revealing very much about himself. So whoever that person is in modern time, I can't even tell you if that's Mitt Romney or not.
Mitt Romney.
That's who he would be.
So no example for Hamilton who you would best suit, do you think?
No, I mean, you have to find someone. I'm sure there's someone that I'm not thinking of,
Yeah.
but you would have to find someone who's self-destructive in some ways, a little extreme, not really focused on public opinion. I don't know who that person is, actually. I mean, can you be a politician and be someone who doesn't really think about public opinion much these days?
There's someone in office right now that I feel like, and I don't want to say it because I can't.
Because Hamilton was brilliant.
Oh, there you go. Okay, good job. I like it.
And had, as you were saying about Burr, had absolute convictions and an overarching plan. I keep saying extreme. He was someone who lived and operated according to plans. That's how he always thought that way. And he was a perfect person to put in this job, because here you go, blank slate, create, a national financial system. He was the person for that job, but he did that according to what he believed the nation should be. So I can't talk about someone who's in office. He's operating in a different realm.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
We could say universe too, like just a wholly different aspect of life.
It's different. Yeah. It's very different.
Are you okay with how the show, the play itself is starting to shape its own sort of history with Hamilton and Washington, even other figures like Jefferson and Adams? I mean, Hamilton is extreme on one end, and the exact opposite reaction is Jefferson, extreme on the completely other different end.
And then Adams is just like a dweeb.
He's also a dweeb, just kind of there and boring. And hi, I'm John Adams. What's up? That's what I feel like's happened.
He doesn't even get to say what's up.
Yeah.
He's not there. Well, if the question is, am I comfortable with people thinking that about these guys and assuming that that's the truth? Not entirely, and so I do a lot of public speaking, and I'm speaking at schools. And so, like I said before, I'm kind of a glass half full kind of person. I can teach against it. Say, you think this, let me tell you what really happened, which is really interesting. So it's an opportunity. But, the play suggests, for example, that Hamilton is this forward-looking guy who's all about, industry, and Jefferson is this backward-looking, slavery-owning, plantation owner. Well, you could flip that, and you could say, and both of those things, Hamilton, not necessarily forward-looking, but certainly that sense of his politics, that he's about industry and centralizing and cities. But at the same time that Jefferson's a slaveholding plantation owner, he's also someone who believed in a kind of democracy that Hamilton did not. Mm-hmm. So you could say Jefferson, in that sense, is seemingly modern or forward-looking in his politics, and that Hamilton actually is backward-looking in his politics. So it's not as simple as either good guy, bad guy, or forward-looking, backward-looking when you let politics into the picture. Like, what a surprise. You let politics into the picture, and it gets more complicated.
Touching upon slavery, the show seems to allude that Hamilton was cognizant of the moral issues of slavery, but never really fully commits that he was against it in the play either. It implies like, yay, I'm on board, kind of. But he doesn't really come out saying it in the play. Is that stance true to his life? Like, how was he about slavery?
Well, now the play does call him an abolitionist a number of times, right? And links him with John Lawrence,
right.
That they're, and it is clear that Hamilton opposed slavery in a general sense, and he was a member of the New York Manumission Society, but when you look at his, all 27 volumes of his writings, what you don't see is a lot of writing or thought going to this purpose. Mm-hmm. You don't, when Hamilton thought something was important, it becomes obsessively important to him, and it's apparent. And he just, there are a handful, 2 or 3 moments, I think, when he refers to slavery in his entire life, and all of the writings of his entire life that we have. So when I say he's an abolitionist, that implies extreme anti-slavery fervor. And that's not how I would define Hamilton. And his father-in-law owned slaves. So he's smack in the middle of that world. I think he's on, quote unquote, the right side of the issue, but I don't think he's a big activist for it. And so with the play, generally speaking, I think people very much want there to be an abolitionist founding father or an anti-slavery founding father. And he's kind of the only guy who, for my students, I break founders into major league and minor league founders.
Nice.
So among the major league founders, he's the guy you can say, we'll pin that on him and he'll be the anti-slavery founder. I just don't think he fits quite comfortably in that role.
Where does he stand among the other founding fathers? Is he looked at like that kid that annoys everybody because he's so young eventually? Or is he really one of those people that people respected and said, okay, like within that group?
Just speaking generally.
Correct.
No, he very much was, in his time within the major league founders. Of course, he assumed, he was among the major league founders, but and saw himself almost as a kind of prime minister when he was Secretary of the Treasury. But yeah, he was a major policy shaper and changer, one of the first and loudest people pushing to change the government after the Revolution. So yeah, he was smack in the middle of the big game going on at that period, and was, in the mix with Madison and Jefferson and Washington. What's interesting to me is for a long time, he kind of wasn't seen that way. Mm-hmm. So I've been public speaking about Hamilton for a really long time. And when I first realized, I think I'm going to have to crank out some of those Hamilton lectures because seems like people are interested in it. Yeah. What I discovered was lots of lectures which essentially all start out by saying, you may not have heard of this person, but he's actually worth studying, Alexander Hamilton. And that was true, right? People kind of generally, they knew maybe that he died in a duel, maybe. Taxi drivers, I'm unfortunately the person who talks to everybody everywhere I go. And so taxis, inevitably at some point, if that topic came up, they would, that's the guy who died in a duel, or that's the $10 bill guy, right? That's what people knew. So this is a really different moment. So now, for years I kept trying to tell people he's important, and now I basically try to tell people he's not as great as you think. Calm down a little on the Hamilton front.
Right.
So is he as important as we're making him out to be?
He was a major, major part of the creation of the national government.
Mm-hmm.
You can't tell that story without him. So yes, he was smack at the center of it.
So you've said something that I'm really attaching myself to, which is this major league and minor league of founding fathers. Like that.
If any students end up listening to this, they're going to totally be able to say, yeah, she did that all the time.
Oh my God. It excites my dorkiness in ways that I can't imagine. So we've obviously the major league founding fathers, you've already highlighted a little bit, Washington, Madison, these guys. Who were some of the lesser known minor league guys that people should know about, but really don't?
John Jay.
Mm-hmm.
Now, John Jay, in some ways you could say he should be a major leaguer, but he's someone that people don't know about. He's the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Now, there's a person who was more aggressively anti-slavery than Hamilton, who also is in the mix. But, no one knows John Jay, or if they do, they know him now because the play announces that he only wrote a couple of Federalist essays and then vanished. And that's all they know.
And he got sick.
Yeah, he's someone right. He deserves a lot more attention than he gets. Another person who, and this represents historian brain, but I'll mention it anyway. My historian brain wishes that there was more out there about Rufus King, not necessarily because Rufus King was absolutely key to things in this period, but he was so deeply respected by Federalists. Like Hamilton, when he wanted an opinion on something, he would ask Rufus King, right? So I wish that at least for historian folk like me, floating around out there was more that I could pull at. And I think lately, actually, I'm thinking of someone now who is working a little bit on Rufus King. But that's a question. Like, why, if he's a minor leaguer, okay, but so why was he that guy to these guys? That's an interesting question, at least to me, if to nobody else.
So you list all these other the major league players who become the MVP, the president. Was Hamilton ever on track to actually be president? And if so, is there part of you that thinks that maybe that would have been a terrible idea?
I don't think he was really on track to be president, and I don't think that would have been a good idea. I don't think he thought he would be president. I think, he knew that he was not a popular politician.
Yep.
He prided himself on that. So he certainly would not have assumed that the public would rise and make him president. That never crossed his mind. Some people like to say that that's really what he was aiming at, but I don't think so. There's no evidence of that really, and there's an opportunity. There's a moment when actually he's almost sent to England to negotiate what becomes known as the Jay Treaty, which reveals to you he was not sent. But one of the things he says in response to that is, I'm not really popular with the people. I'm not the right person for that. You might pick somebody else. So I don't think he assumed he would be president. And I think, actually, if you'd asked him, he'd much rather be prime minister than president, because prime minister, in his mind, is the mover and the shaker. I don't know what the heck he would do with the ceremonial aspects of being president, and he never delegated responsibility, and that would be really bad.
Yeah.
And he did not always play well with others, and that would be bad, too. So I don't think he would have been a great president, but as a prime minister, he had many talents.
One of my favorite parts of Hamilton, the man, is that he was just so self-confident. Like, I'm going to be a lawyer. Okay, I'm going to nail it, and I'm going to be the best at it. And then, hey, guess what? I'm going to be a general. And he does it and doesn't lose a battle. And then he becomes the head of the U.S. Army under President Washington, which I kind of wish the show kind of got into a little bit. I don't know how they could have...
Adams. He becomes
under Adams, correct.
General under Adams.
I kind of wish they went into that a little bit, because that dynamic between the two, especially when we have that hashtag war/not war with France for a little bit there. Does that inform who Hamilton is, and does he really prefer to be called general as opposed to anything else?
Oh, he loved the military and military power. I think the military was like a Hamilton dream place because you give people orders and they have to obey you. I think he liked a regulated world like that, and he was always kind of smitten by the military. I think he was. So I think he really liked being Inspector General of the Army, so second under Washington during what comes to be known as the Quasi-War with France. I think he really liked that. I know in the past, many years ago, looking through his papers during those years, and some of them, I think now they're being added to his papers, but the ones I'm thinking of aren't. He was, this is not necessarily good, but he was so obsessed with, what are the uniforms going to look like? How big should the feathers be in the hats? And there's he drew a picture of a hat with the feather. He was way excited about being Inspector General of the Army. But he also knew he was not well liked by John Adams. So when Washington dies, and the question is what happens now, there's a letter, I can't remember who he writes it to, in which he says to someone, who do you think Adams is going to put in Washington's place? Probably not me. So he knows.
Yeah.
But so, to go back to your original point, he's really, really confident. But I think that's really useful to him on the way up, and that contributes to him on the way down, right? That contributes to the downfall. So when you're an up-and-comer with nothing, with no money, and not a lot of support, you come to the colonies with nothing. It's good to be that really, really creative, confident guy. It's good. There's a point in the Army, when he's in the Army, so he's young, right? He's 19, 20. He writes these letters to the New York legislature, and he's like, here's what I think you should do. It's who does that? Are you joking? So he is that guy, and that really serves him well. But eventually that guy can be a little overconfident, can not think twice about what he's doing or reconsider things. When he writes a pamphlet before the election of 1800, the presidential election, when it's basically John Adams with the Federalists and Thomas Jefferson with the Republicans, and Hamilton doesn't really want Adams to be president. He wants a different Federalist to be president. He writes this pamphlet attacking John Adams, which is mentioned really briefly in the play. I won't pronounce it in this podcast, but sit down, John, you boop. That's in relation to this pamphlet. He asks around a little bit about what people think of the idea, and there's a correspondence between leading Federalists who are essentially each saying to the other, are you going to tell him it's a bad idea? Because I'm not going to tell him it's a bad idea. And eventually one guy says, okay, I'm going to tell him. He may never speak with me again, but I'll do it. So he that kind of confidence is not always good in politics.
No. Well, one of the things that the show does show Alexander Hamilton being confident is that he has a great financial mind when it comes to planning the finances for the country. But Blake said that he actually struggled with his own personal finances, which blows my mind. So did this kind of color his politics at all? How did this affect him?
Well, the fact is there were a lot of sort of founder-esque folk who were deeply in debt. But Hamilton wasn't great with his home finances. He didn't really pay a lot of attention to them. I think, unfortunately for him, in the last couple of years of his life, he assumed he would be a practicing lawyer in New York City, and he would be one of the leading one or two, and he would make a lot of money. And, he had built himself a house. I think he thought that was how he was going to finally make money, which he didn't because he died and thus left his family in debt. But he wasn't very good with his finances. There are these sad letters when he's Inspector General, writing to the Secretary of War, James McHenry, who's a friend of his from the Revolution, basically saying, could you please pay me? I gave up my law practice to be here.
Yep.
And I need the money, right? There's even a letter, and now I can't remember what year. at some point in the 1790s, he loses his bank book. and the letter is to someone saying, could you like duplicate that for me somehow?
Can you imagine?
That's yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I can't imagine someone like Alexander Hamilton just losing his bank book. Yeah, I don't know where I put it. It's around here somewhere.
Oh, man.
Hey, Eliza, have you seen that thing? The book. Yeah. No? All right. Yeah, sure. You know, like, that's what I feel like what
Eliza
happened.
was very good with managing that household.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Eliza, that was not an easy marriage, I think, because he was not an easy person.
Mm-hmm.
And she, was sort of there by his side, sort of, she had to be strong to be that person. But, she lives on forever after he dies, and she's just powerful, aggressive. She has her own politics. She's anti-slavery. At a very old age, she is in Washington, D.C., and she's at a lawyer's office, I think, and the lawyer's like, oh, Mrs. Hamilton, let me call a carriage for you to go home. She's like, I need a carriage, like,
Got this.
woman in her 80s. So she was a strong person who I think really was responsible for managing and controlling the Hamilton household.
How do you think she was portrayed in the play itself?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the play really does, generally speaking, star men. Mm-hmm. And Angelica and Eliza are,
Don't forget Peggy. Don't forget Peggy.
And Mariah Reynolds, too.
Yes.
But really, Eliza and Angelica are the two major female characters. I think there was in real life, when you read their love letters, she clearly was smitten with him. Mm-hmm. He was very nervous that she wouldn't like him. He writes, I think, you're going to correct me on this if I'm wrong, but isn't there a line in the play about being a poor man's wife?
Oh,
yes.
yeah.
Yes.
Right.
Relish being.
Yeah,
yes.
relish being a poor man's wife.
That's from one of his letters, one of his love letters to her before they're married, where he says, don't fool yourself, because I'm not going to be a wealthy man. So do you relish being a poor man's wife? Mm-hmm. So, she certainly, her attachment and her love for him is clear in the play, but she doesn't, she's not a really super fleshed out character, mm-hmm. I would say, in the play. So, I used to call her, when I at some point was studying her after his death, in my mind, I was calling her Betsy Spine of Steel, because she was like this superwoman, she just is so strong and smart in a way that isn't apparent when most of what she's doing is trying to deal with the Hamilton household.
Yeah.
So without getting, into too much of the nerdisms and all the stuff about the story, I can do that on my own time. They do give her a little bit of agency, I think, towards the end of the play, which is, I'm going to burn all these letters. And then even after that saying, no, I'm putting myself back into the narrative and I'm going to tell everybody. So did she really burn the letters? And did she really put herself back into the narrative?
Well, as far as burning the letters, there's no direct evidence that she did that. I mean, the fact is a lot of the wives of these major public figures destroyed some of their personal correspondence because they knew that this was all going to be public and they didn't necessarily want that to be public. So it's possible that she destroyed her correspondence for that reason. And it is true that during her years of being married, a lot of her letters really don't survive. It's a one-sided conversation. That's also true for Washington. That's true for a lot of these figures. Did she burn letters in response to the Reynolds pamphlet? No, but she did, in a sense, put herself back in the narrative because she dedicated pretty much the last decades of her life to chronicling and recording and getting someone to write about her husband's life and legacy, looking for a biographer, helping. Her sons were collecting his papers. So she was really making a narrative around her husband.
Yeah.
But she really was, she's the person who, went to the government about, she had Hamilton's papers. Did the government want to buy his papers? She was really the guardian and constructor of his legacy on paper, in a way. So she wasn't necessarily putting herself in that narrative, but she was constructing the narrative generally.
Would you say that if it weren't for her, Hamilton probably wouldn't be known as well? I mean, are most of the things that we get to know about him through his personal letters and all these things thanks to Eliza? Like, would maybe the musical not have been made? Would you not have had the field that you have, with your focus on him? Is it a lot of thanks to Eliza?
Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is, newspapers at the time, sometimes when they reported about someone who died in a duel, it would say, died suddenly. And I mention that because most of the major public figures in this period didn't die suddenly. They had long retirements. And so they organized their papers. Jefferson spent like almost a decade at least, putting them in order, eliminating, rewriting, and a lot of them did that. And Hamilton had no time for that. Mm-hmm. So certainly we would know a lot less about him. And there would be, I'm sure, some key documents and things that would have vanished into the haze of paper stacks. So she certainly, I'm sure, she became the person trying to do that for his papers. And I'm sure she made what she was doing and her sons made a difference.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about Angelica? What really went on between she and Alexander?
Okay, so first of all, Angelica really was an extremely intelligent woman who seemingly charmed royalty and other figures overseas during her time there. I think she was really, she was a person who impressed both Hamilton and Jefferson. Like, she's really clearly was a woman with a presence. I think, from what I can tell, certainly she had a flirtatious relationship with Hamilton, but it was very publicly flirtatious. They weren't sneaking around. It was like there's a story about them being at a party, and I don't even remember why he bows down in front of her and asks to be a Knight of the Garter, which was shocking. So, and the reason we know this is because someone saw that was like Hamilton was like joking that he wanted to get up under her dress. Like, really? Is that? But I think. There's a book by a historian named Cassandra Good called Founding Friendships. And one of the things it says is that there are these male-female friendships, which nowadays we want to pin on as being, sexual or having a different angle. And that, in fact, there were these very public, flirtatious male-female friendships. There's a letter somewhere, and I can't remember where it is now, that he's flirting with her and Elizabeth signs on at the end something. So she saw the letter. Yeah. You know what I mean? So I just don't think that they had that kind of relationship. However, do I believe it could have gone there? So the famous, the little bit in the play where Angelica is dreaming about a comma that was misplaced.
Yes.
Right. And that instead of saying my dearest Angelica, he supposedly wrote my dearest Angelica. Right. Yes. It's actually Angelica who misplaced the comma and Hamilton who got excited in real life.
Wow.
Hamilton's the one who wrote to her and was like, so I noticed this comma. Like, what did that mean, that comma? Like, really? I don't know. Did you mean, so he's clearly intrigued and she immediately is like, yeah, no.
Calm down.
Right, calm down. So who knows, but generally speaking, I think they had I think they were both the kind of people who loved being that person, right, in public, the person who's like a little bit scandalous, a little bit attracts attention. I think they were similar in that way.
Yeah.
You mentioned the title Founding Friendships, and I want to attack that a little bit from a different perspective. I think a lot of people have this romantic notion in their head that all the founding fathers were like buddies. They were out like drinking, going to the pub, and there's that famous picture of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and all of them are there, and they're all happy to be there, and like half of them weren't in real life, and they're telling other guys to not show up at the right time or whatever. Like, are they all buddies, or do they really, like, most of them can't even stand each other?
They are definitely not all buddies, and many of them definitely couldn't stand each other. And that changed over time, but Yeah, and some of them were people who nobody probably liked very much, but yeah, they're just like, I mean, it's sort of goofy to say, but just like now, right? If you get a room full of people, I was gonna say, you get let's talk about a House of Congress, right? There are going to be people in that room who you admire and like, people in that room who you like but probably aren't super smart, people in that room who you really don't like, people in that room who are really hard to work with. And I think that's just as true. So no, they weren't all buddies. They definitely weren't all going out to get a beer. And sometimes, this is part of what I have done in the past in my work. You can track how a relationship evolves over time and how that shapes what they do politically, and thus how that shapes the nation's politics, which is really interesting to do.
We got James Madison, James Monroe, Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr. Who is the guy that Hamilton is most worried about?
Seriously.
And why?
Ooh, Burr. And so Madison, he was disappointed in, but I don't think he thought he was dangerous. He didn't have a lot to say about Monroe. They actually were a little friendly during the war. But Jefferson and Burr are the two foremost people he's worried about. What that means is that in the election of 1800, when the election is tied between those two men, Hamilton again and again and again explains why Burr is more dangerous than Jefferson. And he basically considers Burr an opportunist who will do anything to get what he wants. And he doesn't like Jefferson. He considers him kind of a demagogue, but he also thinks he has principles. And he doesn't think that Burr does. And he thinks that Burr is just as ambitious as he is. There's no telling what he'll do. So by Hamilton's point of view, Burr is the guy. There are all of these letters that are just like lists of reasons why I hate Aaron Burr, in which he's trying to convince people in the House, as the tied election is being again and again and again voted on in the House, he's trying to convince people not to support Burr. So for sure, that's a person who he thought was particularly dangerous because of his, at least to Hamilton, lack of principles and the fact that he came from the equivalent of New England royalty, his family. So he had that behind him too. And Hamilton knew in these letters, he tells these stories like, you never believe what Burr said at this party. He said at the party. And it was really bad. He's pulling out all the stops. But he certainly thought he was one of the more dangerous men in the Republic.
All I picture is Hamilton, kind of like in Mean Girls with the burn book. He has like a whole burn book just for Aaron Burr. That's what I feel like is going on right now.
I don't think he needed anything in writing. I think he had it all memorized in a file box in his head. The top 8 reasons why I hate Aaron Burr, appended by 89 other reasons why I hate Aaron Burr. I mean, he really, he declares in 1792, so the national government has only been in existence a couple of years. He declares it, quote, his religious duty to oppose Burr's career.
Oh my gosh.
Wow.
Now that's some serious opposition there, right?
My religious duty.
My religious duty to oppose Burr's career. You can't, in a sense, by the end of that trajectory, you can't blame Burr for being a little irritated, right? At this guy who, no matter what happens, he seems to appear and find ways to smack at me in one way or another. And 1804, when they have their duel, is not the first time that they came head to head like that. I think they almost fought a duel in 1800 as well.
Gosh.
Wow.
Why do you think Alexander Hamilton had it out for him so much and would literally say, it's my religious duty to oppose Aaron Burr?
Like those are choice words. Like, why those words?
Which are up on the wall in the Hamilton exhibit in Chicago, because how can you not put, if you're talking about Hamilton and Burr, my religious duty to oppose his career is great. I really do think that Hamilton understood and recognized his talents and his ambitions and the way in which he could adapt himself to different situations and people and audiences, because Hamilton was just as ambitious, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Hamilton, in his mind, Hamilton had absolute principles, and he really didn't think Burr had any. But if Burr is a kind of Hamilton with no principles, Hamilton would understand that as a danger, or certainly that would be the way he would interpret it.
Well, I find it ironic that he says that it's his religious duty because, I know that but most of the public doesn't know that religion wasn't a major part of Hamilton's life in his later years when he went and fought Burr in 1804. It wasn't like as big of a thing. So the fact to call it a religious duty is ironic, I feel like, in the best sense.
I think Hamilton equated religion with passionate engagement. When he at some point in 1800 or 1801, when he's trying to figure out what to do so the people will like the Federalists again, and he thinks about creating what he calls Christian constitutional societies, the Christian part of it is because he assumes people are passionate about Christianity just like they're passionate about the French Revolution. So the other side, they're all emotional about the Revolution. We can use Christianity the same way. So I think that's, in part, how he understood religion. You're right that for much of his life, he isn't really engaged religiously. At the beginning of his life, he appears to be. And then the last couple years, he once again is referring to God in his letters, although he's kind of resigned, that I'm just turning things over to him. I can't. It's sort of a sad Hamilton at the end who, and then after his son dies, particularly, I think, becomes a little bit more religious.
Is Burr really the guy that the play makes him out to be? The one that we're talking about? Is he really without any real convictions? Is he just solely motivated by the idea of, I just want to be in the room where it happens?
No. I mean, I will say he was very cagey about what he thought, and he didn't like putting things that he thought in writing. This does not help our understanding of Burr. It made worse by the fact that a lot of his personal papers sank to the bottom of the ocean because they were in a boat with his daughter, and when she died on this ship that sank, so his papers went. So for any number of reasons, we have less on paper about him. I do think he had some, principles and convictions. He was actually a pretty decent vice president. Mm-hmm. He actually served pretty well. He was objective. I don't think he's like, I was about to say the Benedict Arnold of the founding. Benedict Arnold was the Benedict Arnold of the founding. I don't think he was evil. I think he was cagey and ambitious, and that's a hard combination of things to be.
So then how did the duel come to be? Like, what exactly led up to the duel?
The nuts and bolts of it, as opposed to what the show was giving us.
Right. So what actually leads to the duel is not the election of 1800. The election of 1800 happens. They do, I think, almost fight a duel. You have 4 more years go by, and then Burr decides, well, I'm not going to be vice president anymore because Jefferson doesn't want me to be his vice president. So I'm going to run for governor of New York. And he steps forward again on that state level to gain a position of power. And once again, Hamilton steps out and does all he can to defeat Burr becoming governor. Now, Burr loses this yet again, and he's angry and he's outraged. And he essentially, one of his followers writes that Burr felt that Burr had to do something to prove that he was worth following as a leader at that point. Because why follow him as a leader if he has never any power and he just keeps losing things? So the idea was he loses that election and he had to find some kind of a way to do something to prove that he was a leader worth following, a man of conviction and courage. Dueling was one of the ways in which one could do that. I think, generally speaking, the first insult he came across after that election that would have allowed him to move into that territory, he probably would have seized on and used as a way to show he was a man of honor and a man of courage who was willing to die for his name, and look at me, I'm a good leader. That's how people use dueling. As luck would have it, it's a Hamilton insult that was recorded in a letter. The letter was it was captured and published in a newspaper. The newspaper was stuck in Burr's hands, and so there he had in writing an insult from this person who had been, his religious duty to oppose him for actually 15 years. They say, Burr says in that final correspondence, it's been for 15 years. Wow. We've been doing this for 15 years.
Wow.
So it's an insult. It's a vague insult. And because it's a vague insult, Hamilton has a hard time figuring out what to apologize for. He also writes a stupid letter in response to this. Burr writes a sort of it's almost a form letter that you write when you are initiating an affair of honor. You said this about me. Did you or did you not? You owe me that explanation as a man of honor. So Hamilton gets that letter. When you get that letter, you know that you are now in duel land, right? You know that whatever you do potentially could lead to a dueling ground. So Hamilton knows that, and he writes back this unfortunate letter in which first he says, well, the insult that you're talking about, it's so vague. It says I said something despicable about you. What does that mean? How can I apologize for something despicable? I can't. And duels are supposed to be fought around particular insults. So this doesn't seem like it's going to work to me. So, which is not going to make Burr feel any better. And then at the end, Hamilton writes this blustery sentence so that he doesn't look cowardly and says something like, but of course, I always stand behind my words, which is kind of a dare.
Yeah.
So, he gives Burr a grammar lesson and then dares him.
Yeah.
And Burr responds by saying, okay, now I'm really pissed. Now, and things kind of spiral to a bad place. From there, it gets to a point where both men feel insulted during the negotiations. And so it's clear, rather than just an affair of honor where they exchange these letters and then mutually find a way out, it's going to end up going to the dueling ground.
So within the show itself, it makes it kind of seem that Burr and Hamilton were kind of on okay terms, during the beginning of their political careers. Everything seems to be at least cordial at the very least, if not friendly. And then we have that turning point with Philip Schuyler, where Hamilton decides, okay, I'm going to burn this guy to the ground. Is that kind of the inciting incident for Hamilton, or did it start before or after that?
Well, so here's the complicating factor there. On the one hand, he considers Burr this man whom his political career must be crushed. On the other hand, they're friendly. They go to the same parties. They are co-counsel in legal cases together sometimes. So they're not. It's not like I cannot be in the same room as that man. It's they're cordial with each other. I don't think it helped when he removed his father-in-law from a seat in Congress, but I don't think that was the only thing. I think that's the thing that probably pushed him a little over the edge. But it's significant to note that it was to Hamilton, he thought Burr as a man was a bad politician, but he was perfectly willing to engage with him, So it's really hard to understand how two people who are essentially cordial with each other shoot at each other on a field and one kills the other. But this would not be the only case where a duel was fought between people who needed to prove to the public that they were brave and honorable, but didn't really hate the person they were firing at.
So why didn't Hamilton, why couldn't he just decline the duel?
So it's interesting. So for a couple of reasons. First off, Burr gets ticked off during their negotiations, and rather than asking Hamilton to apologize for that one little despicable, he says, well, now you've really angered me, so I need an apology for 15 years worth of insults. Right? That's essentially going to force Hamilton onto the dueling ground. But Hamilton, wonderfully for historians, writes a final statement about why he's fighting the duel. It's so Hamilton. He puts pen to paper and he's like, let me explain to posterity why I feel I have to fight this duel. And he explains all the reasons why he doesn't want to fight it. And he talks about his family and his debts and his religion. But then he says, I can't apologize for 15 years worth of things I've said about Burr because I think most of them are true. And, he's put me in a situation where I don't feel that I can back out. And at the end of the letter, he says, let me see if I'm going to get the language right. He talks about what he calls, quote, what men of the world denominate honor. If he doesn't fight the duel, he will not be seen as an honorable man. And, quote, in those crises in our country which seem likely to happen, he will then not be a person who can be called on to lead. So what he essentially is saying is, I can't dishonor myself generally, but I really can't because I'm going to probably be called out in the public again because there's going to be a crisis because this government isn't strong enough. And when there is that crisis, I need to be ready for it. He's probably even thinking military. You really can't be a dishonored, proven not brave soldier. So part of it has to do with the fact that he's doing what he felt that he had to do. I don't think he certainly didn't go to the dueling ground thinking he would kill Burr, and I don't think Burr wanted to kill Hamilton. So, if you kill someone in a duel, particularly in the North, things don't normally end so great for you, right? I mean, your enemies all gang up on you, and it looks bad for you, and you have to leave town. And most of the duels fought in New York around this time period. I think there's one in which someone is killed, and that guy has to leave town, which is what Burr basically does. So, it's sad because the duel wasn't about killing. It was about proving themselves leader. And the tragedy of it is that someone was killed.
Is there any documentation on, we just established that Burr probably doesn't want to kill Hamilton. It's more of just the thing of like showing who's macho and, okay, you know what, let's just settle this. We'll walk away. We're cool. And we all got our honor. We proved our manhood here.
It reminds me of like guys in those cars at a red light who just like rev their engines. Like, oh, I'm fast. Well, I'm fast too. Oh,
So, we have the essential Burr in a Corvette and Hamilton in a Dodge Viper. And they're both revving their engines. What the hell happens to lead the Corvette to blow up? Like, how does Burr kill Hamilton? Is there any documentation showing why that happens?
Well, as to why he ends up killing him, not absolutely. I mean, one of the reasons why I say that I don't think Burr wanted to kill him is that there's a letter that he writes to his second as they're negotiating the time and place of the duel. And his second says, "Who do you want to bring for a doctor?" And he says, "We don't need any doctors. Let's just get this thing over with." I don't think he thinks like, "This shall be bloodshed." I mean, he just thinks we're going to do what happens in a duel, which is you go out there, you exchange shots, you both walk away and say, "I am a brave man and leader," and life goes on. So, and I don't think if you had asked him strategically, you think it'd be really smart to kill Hamilton right now? He would not have said yes. So I just don't think that was something he intended to do. And sure enough, he kills Hamilton and he ends up having to leave town. And the newspaper editor who supports him leaves town. The boatmen who rowed him across the river to the dueling ground leave town. His friends. I mean, so it puts him in a really difficult spot. Mm-hmm. So I really don't think he intended to kill Hamilton. Those guns are not the most accurate of weapons. I am by no means an expert on dueling pistols from this time period, but I have shot one, and I was with people who were experts, and none of us could tell when we shot this gun where it was going to go. So it's entirely possible that Burr wasn't aiming for a gut wound, and that unfortunately that's what happened.
So you're saying ultimately it really could have been an unfortunate mishap.
Yeah, it could have been.
Wow.
It could have been.
So there's I hate to dignify this, but I think I have to.
Okay.
Just for the sake of posterity, I think Hamilton would be very proud. A lot of people, well, not a lot. There's been some conspiracy theories out there that Hamilton used the duel as a mechanism to kill himself, to commit suicide. Is that a bunch of trash, or is there like anything to that at all?
First off, suicide by duel is a pretty tough way to go.
Yeah. Particularly
if duels aren't about killing. But I don't think that's the case. When you fought a duel, you had to assume you might be killed. And so you typically said farewell, cruel world in some kind of a statement because you might die. Burr writes a farewell statement too. They both assume they could die. Mm-hmm. But there's a letter that Hamilton writes at some point in the 1790s, and it's about national honor. And it says something along the lines of, not to defend national honor is to commit political suicide. Mm-hmm. Not to defend honor. So I don't think that that's what he was doing. I think his letter in which he says, "I got to preserve my honor because you never know when I'm going to need it again," is pretty much on the money. And also, knowing how indebted he was, there's no way he would have, been like, "Sorry, family, I'm going to leave you in debt, signing off." I don't think that was his intention.
So where did Burr go? He goes off with his boat friend, and where does he disappear off to, and what actually ended up happening to him?
Well, so he goes to South Carolina. So he goes way south. Mm-hmm. they're kind of pleased with him in South Carolina. They're not really upset at the fact that he killed Hamilton. He hides there for a while at a friend's house. He is the vice president at the time.
So awkward. So awkward.
Awkward. Eventually, he goes back to preside over the Senate again. And there are these really interesting letters from Federalist senators who don't quite know what to do with the situation. This man who killed someone who they considered to be their leader, or certainly one of their leaders, is now parading back into the Senate, and he's going to preside over them. What? Like, how? And then at some point, there's a letter, I think, in which one Federalist says the Republicans are even acting friendly towards him. They're going up to shake his hand like he did them a favor, you know. So he ends up going back and finishing out his term. Some people commented that when he comes back, he looks a little careworn, you know, that it wasn't necessarily an easy thing to be in the situation that he was in. But as I said earlier, you know, he's a fine vice president. He finishes his term. He has this amazing speech that he gives at the end, which I'm not going to do it justice. But basically he says, if this republic ever dies, its final moments will be on the floor of Congress. It's a powerful statement. It's like, here is where we protect the republic or where we don't. Like this matters. What we do matters. And then he's pretty much at that point, national politics aren't going so well. State politics aren't going so well. So then he says, the West. I'm going to wander out west. So it's unclear what he was doing. He brought a bunch of men with him, armed. It appears that maybe he was putting himself somewhere near Mexico so that if something happened down there, he could be in on a new empire or somehow be in a position of power. It's totally unclear what the heck he was doing. But whatever he's doing, he's with a small group of guys in guns wandering around out west.
So weird.
Right. And talking occasionally to diplomats from foreign countries, and this doesn't look good. So he's tried for treason. He's found not guilty. But now he's pretty much got to leave the country. Yeah. So he goes to Europe. He exiles himself in Europe for a number of years. He hangs out with Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin for a while. Stays there. I think has what seems like a rather exciting, affair-filled life with not a lot of money in Europe. And then comes back in his old age, back to New York, and goes back to practicing law. But by that point, he's something of a tourist attraction. And people would go up to his office and look in the windows so that they could say that they had seen Aaron Burr.
Wow.
So it's kind of a painful ending for him.
That is a painful. I can't even imagine that.
Especially for a guy that, like, he wanted to be where the important stuff was, but he didn't necessarily want to be, like, the center of attention, loud. You know, I stand for XYZ, and now people are like, you're the guy that killed Hamilton, and then was, like, a weird guy just walking around Mexico. Like, he's like the Loch Ness Monster. Like, I saw him. Like, they leave New York with the shirt, you know?
Yeah, I saw Burr.
I saw Burr.
Well, you know, it is true that because he died in 1836, so he goes on for a while, right? It is true that the people from that generation who survived for a while, all of them are like, I saw so-and-so, because it's like this living link to the revolution, right? So Burr is one of those people. Elizabeth Hamilton is one of those people. She lives to be in her 90s.
Wow.
She lives into the 1850s. She sees the Washington Monument begin to go up. And so she also becomes a person that if she's at a party, people write to their friends and acquaintances, I saw Elizabeth Hamilton. Like, she was at this party. And because she's like this weird link to the founding and the revolution and George Washington, you know. So it's pretty, people at the time thought it was pretty remarkable that these people lived such long lives.
They would have taken a selfie with him, I bet.
Oh,
Might have
yeah.
been modern times.
Yes.
So many selfie sticks.
That would have been the never-ending plague of their old age, would have been selfies.
Yes.
And yeah, I can't even imagine. I'm not even going to imagine poor Elizabeth Hamilton.
Just walking around with her purse, be like, "Get out of here!" You know. There's this great bit at the end of the play where, you know, they have all the, you know, Washington and Madison and Jefferson come out and saying, you know, this guy, he really did it, and he was pretty smart. I tried to, you know, dismantle. I couldn't even do it. And having said that, though, in the real world, what do you think, and this is a big question, so I apologize, but what do you feel like is his lasting legacy?
Alexander Hamilton's lasting
Alexander
legacy.
Hamilton. What's his lasting legacy for, I think, the country on a political level, but for us as citizens of that country?
Okay, so I would say in a general way, Hamilton was a person who at a very early point understood that the Articles of Confederation, the government, needed to be more powerful, needed to be more centralized, and never stopped pounding for that. And then was there at the Federal Convention, the Constitutional Convention when it happened, and continued pounding that way throughout his time as Secretary of the Treasury. Now, sometimes he might have pounded a bit too hard and maybe pushed a bit too far, but the fact of the matter is his willingness and energy in doing that mattered a lot. You needed a person to push hard. People pushed against him, but you needed someone to be there to move things in a direction for people to respond. So he played a significant role for that reason. And more than that, he really did create a financial plan for the nation. He really did lay a lot of groundworks for things. I mean, you can't say he created modern America. A lot happened between Hamilton and now, but you can say that he laid a lot of groundwork that people built on in generations after that mattered. So I think his efforts and his vision of the Republic really mattered. I think his understanding of the Constitution, again, his understanding of the Constitution is where we are, what we've now taken, and that's been a big, it's done a lot for American politics. It's probably also not always helped American politics, but he believed the Constitution should be interpreted in a very broad way. What that meant is that the national government is more powerful. And one might say that there aren't always times when you want the national government to be more powerful, but that was an important precedent. So in a whole bunch of ways, he set important precedents. He laid a lot of groundworks. He had a vision that mattered. I would also say, and I think it's important to think about this nowadays, American politics has always been intended to be a conversation, an argument. It could be an angry conversation, a fraught conversation, but what happened in the founding was that people with different ideas argued about it and fought with each other and tried to quash the other guy, but they didn't ever assume that there should be no debate. So he was part of that debate, along with Jefferson, who disagreed with him, but the fact that they clashed shows what was supposed to be happening, right? So even in that way, particularly nowadays where there's kind of an all or nothing mode of politics that we're practicing, it's important to remember that even Hamilton, with his strong views, understood that he was part of a conversation and that he had to bring in some way or another the public along with him. Mm-hmm. And that's really important.
The fact that you had somebody that could push so hard and so fervently in one direction, let's say that's Hamilton, and then have another person push so hard and so in such a completely opposite direction, where right. In Jefferson, where it's like, yeah, you know what? Just let the people do what they want to do. Let's not have I don't even want government. Let's just live by the French Revolution idealism. Let's do that.
Don't know if he would have gone quite that far, but yes. Yeah. For sure, he wanted a much smaller, much less centralized national government, and he wanted the states to really retain a lot of that power. So yeah, he's pretty much pushing in the opposite direction. And you could make a list of things that Hamilton's like, yeah, cities, yeah. And Jefferson is like, cities are sores on the country, just like, sores on a human body. You could march your way down. Hamilton, we need to be like England. Jefferson, the ideals of the French. But yeah, you needed the other. Each needed the other to push to end up with a kind of compromise position that I think ultimately, or at least so far, served us well.
So if Hamilton were alive today, what is the one question that you would like to ask him?
Oh, wow. What I would like to ask him? Wow. There's like a lot of answers to that. But, given how much time I've spent over the years writing about his duel, and given the fact that I had to kind of reason out my understanding of him, boy, would I love him to narrate his way through what happened and why he did what he did and what he was thinking as to why he did what he did. Partly so that in general, I could hear a duelist do that, and partly because I've written about it so much. I always think if Hamilton came back and I got to ask him a question, he would be freaked out because I know everything he's ever written, right? Well, I know that you said in 1783, like, who are you?
Yes.
Why do you know all about me? But I might want to ask him about the duel. I might want to ask him questions about those very early years of the government. The first couple of years when it was so in formation and what that was like. I don't know. There's too many questions, but certainly one that looms large is about the duel.
Wonderful. Now, of course, the duel is really like what got you your link to the musical. If you want to just tell us a little bit about what that experience was like.
How that all happened.
Yeah, that was interesting. So, okay, so there's a two-part Goofy story. So the first part of the Goofy story is I heard that there was a crazy person writing a musical about Alexander Hamilton. Didn't know who he was. Just knew that he was out there, and it was going to be based on a biography. And I thought, well, that's fine, but Hamilton's own words had better be in it, because there's certainly not going to be a second musical about Alexander Hamilton during my lifetime. So if there's only one, I want Hamilton's real words to be in the play. And I didn't know how to get that idea to him. I wanted to give him a copy of my edited collection of Hamilton's letters and basically say, put some of this in the play. So a friend of mine said, well, I'll just ask him on Twitter. And at this time, I was not on Twitter at all. I didn't even really know what it was. And I was like, yeah, you go ahead and do that. You go ask Lin-Manuel Miranda on Twitter if I can give him this book. Now, that was the day that I was about to have my 50th birthday party. And the National Park Service, I've done a lot of work for them over the years about Hamilton's house, the Grange. They let me throw my 50th birthday party in Hamilton's house.
Oh my gosh.
Lots of rules, but the house became a park site on the day I was born. So the house and I turned 50 on the same day, which is a little spooky. So that was where I was having my 50th birthday party. My friend contacted him on Twitter and said, my friend's a Hamilton scholar. She wants to give you a book and she's having her birthday party in the Grange tonight. You should come. And he did.
Dude, he's just the coolest dude on this planet. Just shows up.
Dude. So he just very quietly showed up. Just in case he came, I had brought a copy of the book. I was like, you came! So I handed him the book. I was like, this represents what I think are some of the most important writings Hamilton did. Take the book, read the book, put Hamilton's words in the show.
Yes.
Put Hamilton's words in the show. And then that was that, right? And so some of my friends now, years later, they're like, I went to your birthday party and chatted with Lin-Manuel Miranda. I was like, that was a while back.
Yeah.
But so then I forgot about it and it went away. And then I was forced to join Twitter. But I only knew two people on Twitter, my friend and Lin-Manuel Miranda. So I checked first on one and then I checked on the other. And beamed in at a moment when he was making a Hamilton joke. And I responded to the Hamilton joke. And he was like, Joanne Freeman's on Twitter. So we kind of reconnected a little bit. And when the show was off Broadway, we met a couple of times and chatted about Hamilton. And he was really picking my brain. It was like beyond fun, those conversations. But then I go see the show. And there's as it's going along, there's a dueling song, the 10 Duel Commandments, right? And I'm with a friend who's a historian and a good friend of mine. And I'm like, oh, excellent. There's a dueling song. Like, how good is this? And they're beginning to sing. And I'm like, oh, it's a rules of dueling song. Even better. And then I'm like, and it so sounds like some of the stuff I wrote in chapter 4 of my book. But it can't be, right? It can't be, because Ron Chernow interviewed me about dueling when he was writing his biography. So I assumed whatever seemed me like was probably Freeman through Chernow. But then there's a line in the song about the doctor turning his back so he could have deniability.
Yep.
That comes from a document I found at the New York Historical Society that's in my book. And when that lyric came out, I turned to my friend and I was like, oh my God. They're kind of singing a little bit of my book.
Yeah.
That's for my book. So when I met him after the show and asked, he said, yeah. I said, is that song? Like, is that based on, he's like, yeah, of course. It's like, okay.
Oh my gosh.
Of course.
Yes.
So that, a number of things linked me with the play. He did a lot of studying when he was writing it and honing it, and really a remarkable amount of reading. He found that book on his own. I didn't give him my first book about, with the duel and everything else in it. He found that on his own and read it and incorporated it. So he was impressive to talk to in that way. But over time, as the play began to get more and more insanely popular, I began to be more and more asked to speak about Hamilton, going to high schools to talk about Hamilton, doing public lectures about Hamilton. So in one way or another, I was always connected to the play. And then about 2 years ago, the people who produced the play decided that they were going to do an exhibit, partly to correct the play and fill in the gaps around it, and take advantage of the popularity of the play to tell a bigger story. So they hired me as the historical consultant for that.
Very cool.
It was really interesting. It was really a fun project to work on. And we tried to fill in what should have or could have been in a different kind of play. The first thing you confront after the introduction to this exhibit is slavery, right? It's there at the beginning. It's there throughout. You can't understand that world without understanding that slavery is an enormous part of it, even his youth, So anyway, the exhibit tries to do a lot of work to fill in things that there's no reason why a musical should have done, but it would be excellent if people knew about them.
Yes.
But it was fascinating because it was, the people who produced Hamilton. It was David Corrins, who was the stage designer for Hamilton. It was Tommy Kail, who's the director. It was I guess for a while, maybe Alex Lacamoire was ultimately involved with the music. Jeffrey Seller, who's the producer, was involved. So they were the ones who were doing this project. And they're obviously that's theater. And I'm like beaming in from like history out of space. And figuring out how to meet at a middle point was really hard because neither one of us quite knew what to ask the other. And I could, at the beginning, I was just like lecturing. At the beginning, I would go to David Corrins' house and sit in his living room with some people from his staff. And like, he would say, today we're talking about Yorktown. And I would just talk about Yorktown. And people would take notes, and be like, well, so in the end, what's important to know about Yorktown? It's like, well, blah, blah, blah. And I would leave those meetings and I would think, I hope that was useful because, it was really hard. And ultimately, the moment that kind of captures for me the weirdness of and how fascinating it was to try and get the language of history and the language of theater to bang up against each other, to meet. We had a really hard time figuring out how to talk about Hamilton's financial plan. That's just not too zippy a topic, right? It's like, how are we going to make that interesting for the general public and yet be true to what it was? And we kept coming up with ideas, and we didn't like them, and coming up with ideas, and we had things on the wall, and things, on a whiteboard, and we couldn't figure it out. And finally, I kind of didn't know what else to say, and I said, look, here's the most important thing about Hamilton's financial plan. It was unclear if it would work. It was unclear if the whole government would work. Everything was contingent. No one knew what would happen. So there's a pause, and then David Corrins says, so what if when people enter the room where we talk about the plan, the ground is a little bit uneven, so people are a little thrown off?
Oh, that is so cool.
Right. It was like a little brain explosion. I was like, oh my gosh, he's making physical the statement that I just made about history.
Yes.
In a million years, it would never have occurred to me to suggest that, but that was fascinating. So it was really fascinating project to work on. And unlike anything I've ever worked on before, it's like an immersive history experience.
Yeah.
It's also a piece of theater. But in the end, I feel like it certainly can't communicate everything that needs to be communicated, but it certainly fills in a lot of the gaps around the play and will leave people with a more complex understanding of Hamilton and his world. And it even corrects some of the specific facts in the play.
Love it.
So the exhibit's in Chicago right now, correct?
Correct.
And it does, there are plans to move it. You don't necessarily know when or where, but there are plans for it to travel.
I don't know when or where, but yes, it was intended to be a traveling exhibit. I know that there was talk of it being at some point in San Francisco. There was talk at some point of it being in New York. It's amazing to me that it's intended to travel because it's the size of an airplane hangar.
Wow.
With this intricate, wonderful David Corn's constructions in it. I have no idea how you do that. I guess theater people might know how you do that, but I don't know.
Let those nerds figure it out. They'll take care of it.
A different kind of nerd can figure that out. But anyway, it is supposed to travel. So yeah, and I would love if it did because it does a lot of, I think, good history teaching.
What's the one quirky thing about Hamilton that nobody knows that you want the public to know?
Ooh. That I want?
Or that would just be fun that we wouldn't think of. Yeah.
Okay. Something about him that we wouldn't. One thing that, I don't know if it'll be surprising, but I don't think many people realize it about Hamilton because I think you have to read his papers, all of his papers, to understand the degree to which this is how he thinks. He's a plan-minded guy. He creates plans with steps about everything. That's how he thinks. And so when he comes first to New York from the Caribbean, he comes with a limited amount of money that was raised as charity, a couple of connections that he had through people in the Caribbean, and not a lot else. And he's going to go to college. So if you're a Hamilton in that situation, you would make a plan. And he did, which I don't think most people realize. He came up with he basically thought about all of or at least the major ways in which you could be what they would have considered to be a gentleman in this time period, right? You could go into the clergy, you could go into the army and become an officer, you could become a physician, become a doctor. Hamilton took anatomy lessons. Hamilton took debating lessons. Oh, and lawyer is the last one. Hamilton took debating lessons. Hamilton sort of made it known that he was a religious person. He covered the bases. He covered every base that he needed to cover so that whatever direction he went in, he was going to have some training for it. That's really Hamiltonian. And it happens again in a goofy way during the war with the Marquis de Lafayette. Mm-hmm. Hamilton wants a field command. He wants to be out in the field commanding troops. And he keeps asking Washington, and Washington keeps saying, no, I need you at headquarters. So finally, what does he do? He comes up with a 4-part plan. So first, he writes a letter to Washington asking for this, and Washington says no. Then he speaks to him in person and asks, and Washington says no. Then he writes a letter to the Marquis de Lafayette asking him to write a letter. And clearly part 4 was, then you can go in person, right? If he doesn't say yes to the letter, Lafayette, then you can go in person. The reason I know this is how he planned it is because Lafayette sees Washington and he writes to Hamilton and says, he was right next to me. I wasn't going to write a stupid letter. Why should I bother with a letter? So I just asked him. And Hamilton is like, no, you're supposed to write a letter, like eliminated one of his 4 chances to get a field command. Yes. So that's very him. It kind of shows you why he was good at being Secretary of the Treasury.
I have one final question. Ooh. And I find that it's kind of apropos to leave on this question. Okay. One of my favorite history professor of all time used to say that, history is not about dates and names. That's why we got books. It's about the questions and the why. So my question for you is for all of us who are, listening.
I wish he was my teacher because I kept getting bad grades because I would forget the names and dates. That's not my forte. And I would just name everybody George or Bob.
And it all happened in 1852.
Exactly, right?
For all of us who are, history dorks, or for all of us who aren't, but just happen to love to listen to Hamilton or love the musical or whatever. On our own time, what are the questions we should be asking? What are the questions we should be pursuing when it comes to Hamilton, the man, the myth, or the legend? Where should we be focusing our efforts on the why?
You just went so deep.
I did.
Oh, that was very deep. Okay, so I'm going to give you a two-part answer, which is so historian of me, right? I have a two-part answer. So the first part is Hamilton related. And I would say, to really understand him, you kind of have to get his politics, right? So, and I know it's not exciting to read about the assumption of state debts, or the report on manufacturers, but to learn more about him, you have to at least kind of get a sense of what he was looking for as Secretary of the Treasury. So if you're asking for a specific question about Hamilton, I would say, figure out what made him tick. Why was he so enthusiastic and dedicated to what he wanted? What about it drove him, right? That would be a good question to ask, only because it's not addressed in the play. And that would be a good way for people to get more than arrogant, irritating asshole, which is communicated in the play. But I think related to that, on a bigger level, if you were to ask me the kinds of questions or the kind of outlook people should have in thinking about history, one of the answers I would give is history is about people making choices. You have to understand that they're real people, and then you have to figure out why they made a choice. So, the play helps us remember that these people are real people. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge part of understanding history, is not idolizing people, not thinking that they're heroes, but seeing them as real people, all kinds of people, not just dead white guys, and trying to figure out why either they made a choice or why they were prevented from making a choice. But one way or another, I think that's an important thing to think about when you're thinking about history.
Well, that does it. You survived our talk. I just wanted to say thank you.
Yes, thank
so much.
you.
Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, it is my absolute pleasure.
Joanne Freeman, ladies and gentlemen. Don't you just feel smarter now?
Yes.
Don't you feel wicked smart now?
Incredibly.
I promised a good geek out, dork out session in a very special manner with all of us history dorks. And I think we delivered on that promise. I think we absolutely delivered on that promise.
You're welcome.
So you can actually find Joanne on Twitter, and you can find all of her books and all of her publishings, everything you could ever think of. I'll have it all in the show notes for you here at either MarianBlake.com or on Patreon. You'll be able to see it all there. And I'm really happy that she took the time to join us. I mean, this is someone who's really important. This is like the Albert Einstein of Alexander Hamilton.
And as you got to hear, like, she was influential in some of the aspects to the musical, to components of the musical, and then of course to the exhibit in Chicago. Like, this woman knows her stuff. And I think that it's really cool that she has spent so much of her life researching Alexander Hamilton, speaking about him, writing about him, and then Alexander Hamilton becomes mainstream popular.
Right.
Guys, I felt like this when I used to tell people, oh, I like this stuff called Game of Thrones. And it's really cool, guys. And people were like, you're a nerd. You know nothing. And I was like, no, you know nothing.
Jon Snow.
Gosh, you don't even know what that means. You don't even know what that means. And then all of a sudden it got big, and they made T-shirts about it in Target, and people are talking about it. People who used to make fun of me about it. And I doubt people made fun of Joanne Freeman. I doubt they did. Maybe they did. Let's be real. People are cruel, okay? Joanne, if you're listening, if people made fun of you for researching so much about Alexander Hamilton, know that we got your back, girl. We got your back.
We were made fun of too.
And you want to know what, Joanne? Now you get to sit there and say, look at what happened now.
I know. I'm awesome. That's what you get to say, Joanne. And the great thing about Joanne too was also that, and I actually said this about Ed Ayers when we interviewed him on Outlander Cast for the history of colonial North Carolina. Like Ed, Joanne has a great sense of humor about her.
Correct.
And I think she's in on the joke. Like, she knows how dorky it is. Like, we know too. And we're both here.
We're all in this together.
We're all in this together talking about Hamilton for an hour and 45 minutes. So she's in on it. And the sense of humor along that comes with it is great. And it makes it relatable. And it makes the history of Alexander Hamilton and colonial North America, it makes it all relatable. It makes it's not so stuffy. one of the things I said when we had Ed on for Outlander Cast was, man, some history professors or some history people are real stuffy. I mean,
that's why I didn't do well in history.
I totally agree. And that's why a lot of people don't do well in history, because the history for a lot of people is just a book and dates and names, and that is it. And you can't relate to that as a person. You can't relate to that as a human being. Never mind when we were kids, but especially now in 2019. The beauty behind it is that we have things like Hamilton the musical that make these people real. That make, even though it's a heightened reality, even though it is a story that we're watching, and there's a lot of creative license taken with it, at least you get a grasp on a person. You can get broad strokes of Hamilton or George Washington or John Adams or whoever, and then you can decide as an adult or as a kid, I want to learn more about that, because you finally understand them as a person. And thank God we have someone like Joanne who's out there and saying, yes, this is a gateway. This is opening the door for all of these people. And I'm here to let them all in and say, hey, you like this? Well, guess what really happened? And not in like a I'm pointing down from my ivory tower pointing fingers way, but like, let me further enlighten you. I loved that she took that stance. Would you agree with that, Mary? Like, someone who's not a history person, would you agree with that stance?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Absolutely.
The crowd goes wild. Yeah.
What is this, ASMR? What are we doing?
I don't know.
Well, Marvin, are you ready to close this bad boy out? You got anything else going on for it?
No, my mind is blown, and I wish that Joanne was my professor.
Me too.
Growing up, because I would have probably done better than get a B+.
And called everybody George.
Literally, American history, junior year. It wasn't AP, it was honors. I named everyone Bob, George. One guy, I knew his name was George. I forgot his last name. I put down George of the Jungle.
Oh, my God. No.
Not great, Bob.
Nope.
Nope, not great at all. All right, let's close this bad boy out.
You'll be back, soon you'll see. You remember you belong to me. You'll be back, time will tell. You remember that I served you well. Oceans rise, empires fall. We have seen each other through it all. And when push comes to shove, I will send a fully armed battalion to remind you of my love.
Well, ladies and gents, are you ready? Are you ready to do some deep diving into Hamilton the musical? Because that's what's about to go down. Now that you've gotten the real historical basis, we're going to bring it. Now, of course, if you like other things that Blake and I like, we completely recommend that you head on over to maryandblake.com to check out all of our other podcasts.
All the podcasts, including, like I said, This Is Us Too, Outlander Cast, The North Remembers. We're even doing coverage of The Handmaid's Tale.
Via blogging.
Oh
my gosh, we're so 2010.
I know. But, I thought that was a fun way to get people to enjoy the site, the many facets of it. And if you do like this Rise Up podcast, well, you're going to be very happy because we're going to be bringing on some extra experts. And the next episode, as a matter of fact, we'll be talking about the story itself, analyzing it as though it were just a book or a television show, a movie. We're going to be looking at it, the story as in general. How does it work? What is great with it? What needs to be adjusted? And as a story, is it one of the better stories ever told? Just as it's written. We're going to be bringing on a special guest to talk about that with us. So I'm very excited.
So
I'm not going to say anything yet. I'm not going to say anything yet.
Intriguing.
Not gonna say, but it's someone very special, very good. He's a good guy. So I'm excited about it.
All right. Well, as for now, ladies and gents, I'm Mary Larson.
My name's Blake.
And Rise Up, ladies and gents. Why did you write ladies and gents?
That's
twice?
What you said last time.
Wait, you want me to word for word, because I'm Ron Burgundy, and this is what I do. I read the Google Drive. You put, as for now, ladies and gents, I'm Mary Larson. And then you put, and Rise Up, ladies and gents.
Oh, that was not what I wanted it to do.
I don't even know if we should keep this. This is just our second episode.
No. We'll just redo it. We'll redo it again.
Well, what do you want me to say? You gotta write something new, man.
We'll say, I'm Mary Larson.
As for now, wait, what? I'm Mary Larson.
My name's Blake.
And rise up.